stamping a brutal control over large swathes of Syria and Iraq, and seeking the support of those politically and ideologically disillusioned. But how much does the armed group ISIL owe its existence to the failings of the Arab Spring? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. The reasons were many: disenchantment with long-time leaders, frustration with corruption and unemployment, sectarian tensions, and anger over oppression of free speech and human rights abuses. The so-called Arab Spring raised hopes of regime change and a path towards democracy across the Middle East and North Africa. Well, Tunisia has emerged with credit and a new constitution, but for many those dreams remain elusive. In Libya and Egypt, Yemen and Syria, spilling over into Iraq. So has that disillusionment found a new focus? The armed group ISIL has seen its ranks swell over the past year. Just this month, recruits from Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Saudi Arabia swore allegiance to the self-appointed Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And all this has spurred a resurgent al-Qaeda seeking to reassert its relevance. Well, to help us discuss this further, I'd like to bring in our guests. Here with me in the studio is Robert Becker, an international political consultant who was convicted in Egypt's NGO crackdown in 2011. Joining us from London is Fawaz Gerges, a chair of contemporary Middle Eastern politics and international relations at the London School of Economics. And also Eugenio Lilli, founder of the King's College US Foreign Policy Research Group and teaching fellow at the UK Joint Services Command. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Fawaz Gerges. To what extent is ISIL the product of failed expectations, do you believe?
Well, ISIS is a product of failing institutions, of collapsing state structures, of spreading sectarian ideological and social fires, of the civil war in Syria that has given ISIS motivation, skilled fighters, funding, a social base. I mean, you started, Mike, by putting your finger on the pulse of really the challenge facing the Arab world. Let's recall the aspirations and the rallying cries of millions of Arabs at the start of the Arab Spring uprisings. What were the rallying cries? Justice, freedom, dignity. What we're talking about here, empowerment, effective citizenship. Where was Al-Qaeda? Nowhere to be seen. Where Al-Qaeda slogans? Anywhere to be heard by millions of Arabs? Nowhere, nothing. So what we need to understand, why ISIS, why Al-Nusra Front, why Al-Qaeda have revived. What were the conditions that have allowed these extremist ideas to fill the space that basically left by disappearing governments and also by fragile institutions. Again, we need to talk about that the aspirations of millions of Arabs have been aborted. The idea what ISIS and Al-Nusra Front and Al-Qaeda are telling the Arab world, change will come through the barrel of a gun, not through the ballot box. Well, because of the Arab civil war that's taken place in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen and other places.
Well, Eugenio Lilli, at the time of the Arab Spring, Al-Qaeda basically stepped back. It said, let the people have their say. It offered no involvement whatsoever. The question that Fawaz is asking there, what has happened? Where did this vacuum come from that has allowed groups like ISIS to apparently flourish at this stage?
Well, first of all, I would like to clarify that Al-Qaeda did actually try to take credit for the unrest in 2011. I remember Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri even claiming that the Arab Spring was a direct consequence of the 9/11 terrorist attacks a decade earlier. Al-Qaeda and like-minded terrorist groups depicted the objectives of the Arab Spring as in line with their rejection of the status quo in the Middle East. But despite their efforts, such groups played only a marginal, if any, role in the initial phases of the uprising. At the time, there was this feeling that the overwhelmingly peaceful nature of the Arab Spring and the popular demands for democratic reforms had thoroughly discredited the extremists' argument that change in the Middle East could only be achieved through violence. However, this opportunity was missed. 4 years down the road, we are looking at a completely different situation. Prolonged instability and the collapse of state security institutions in many Arab countries have provided extremist groups with greater freedom of movement and action. In addition to that, the Arab Spring, the peaceful Arab Spring, has mostly failed, with the exception of the still hopeful Tunisia, to deliver significant change. Finally, an democratically elected government has been overthrown by a military coup in Egypt. Together, all these elements seem to have given fresh and new currency to the old and traditional Al-Qaeda's argument that only violent jihad can achieve change in the Arab world.
Well, Robert Becker, I mean, to go back to that Arab Spring, you were working with Salafi groups in Egypt, in fact, coming to a democratic system, engaging within a political protest. These are types of groups from which many of ISIL supporters are now being drawn, are they not?
Yeah, no, initially in 2011, the Salafi political parties, they were playing by the rules as laid out in Egypt. I mean, I was training a number of different ideologies and political parties, but while I didn't agree with their outlook and ideology, they were playing by the rules and running candidates and winning seats. So, you know, this is, I mean, the Arab Spring, your guest had hit on the call for dignity. I mean, that's sort of the common denominator here. And, you know, I wouldn't call it necessarily a failure. Have there been setbacks and stalled? Yes, but this is a long-term process. I mean, we have to look at the sort of the evolution of democracy, and it takes years, not months. And I think that's one of the mistakes that some of these countries made, is they thought an election would be enough. Yes,
Fawaz, on that particular point, you are seeing the emergence of these groups or added space for them to operate. Is this just a kind of hiccup in a process? Is it, in fact, a longer-term process than people had thought?
It really is. I think it would be highly counterproductive to say that the Arab Spring uprisings have failed. This is a historical process, a process that takes decades, not years. Similar historical processes, whether you're talking about Western Europe or Asia or Latin America, we're talking about decades for this particular process to produce basically the desired effects. So the setbacks and the reversals are to be expected. And yes, I would argue that nasty as it is, insidious as it is, deadly as it is, ISIS does not reflect either the aspirations or motivations of millions of Arabs. ISIS is a social parasite that has been able to infiltrate the fragile Arab body politics. Mike, think of the Arab body politics. Its immunity system is fragile for a variety of reasons. The lack of legitimacy, weak institutions, the economic situation. 43% of Arabs live below the poverty line or in poverty. You have counter-revolutionary powers that are trying to postpone the inevitable. So what ISIS has done as a social parasite, it has infiltrated the weak and immunity system. This does not mean that it speaks either for the millions of Arabs who have revolted against the oppressive status quo, or even, in fact, it is the state of the future. But for the moment, it's doing a great deal of harm, because you have spreading civil wars in Syria and Iraq, and without putting out the fires that are spreading, you're going to have a Nusra Front, you're going to have extremist groups who basically keep on infiltrating this body politic and establishing a social base and manipulating the sectarianism, which has become truly poisoning the veins of Arab politics.
Well, Eugenia Lillo, that point about sectarianism, which has become A focal point, in a way, of operations of group like ISIL, certainly making use of Shia-Sunni divide, remembering ISIL started off as fighting against the Iraqi government, then spreading its action against another Shia-based government in Syria. To what extent, though, the point that is made there about it being a parasite that feeds off the failures in Arab society, to what extent do you think that that is a correct observation?
This is a difficult issue, but I think that when we talk about the Islamic State, we need to keep in mind that this is a larger coalition. We're talking about a group that has managed to become the public face of a larger insurgency that contains several diverse militant Sunni groups. So, in my opinion, this is something that goes beyond the Islamic State and al-Baghdadi. And this has implications for the way we should address this threat in Iraq and in Syria. It's clearly like, I don't see the Islamic State as the long-term solution to the economic, social, and political grievances that the people that took to the street in 2011 were demanding, the kind of reforms they were demanding. The Islamic State is something, I think, something temporary. And then we will see that if and when the Islamic State-led coalition manages to defeat its Sunni, its Shia enemy in Iraq, this coalition, this heterogeneous coalition, will probably collapse, because there are many reasons for this. There are reasons that goes into the nature of this coalition. We have diverse groups that see each other as enemies. Some extremist groups, Islamist extremist groups within the Islamic State, they consider Ba'athists in the coalition to be infidels. These tensions will come to the surface, and they will matter. And another reason why the Islamic State is not going to be the solution for the Arab people is that it simply does not have the knowledge, the know-how to be in power. One thing is being at the opposition. One thing is to have the skills to wage an insurgency, a war. But these same skills are not necessarily the ones that you need to run a country.
But I want to pick up on that point that you made. I will come back to you, Eugenio, but I want to put to Robert Becker a point that you brought up there, that what is keeping these disparate groups together within a body like ISIL is common enemies. The US on the one hand, as we heard mentioned there, a government in Iraq, on the other one in Syria. Without these common enemies, does it all fall apart?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, and you know, there's not really an ideology at play. I mean, they're sort of the enemy of everybody. I mean, the foreign captors that have been executed on YouTube get all the global attention, but I mean, women, children, people from all walks of life that are just being tortured, raped, executed. So nobody in Iraq or Syria stuck their hand up and said, we would like this medieval sort of violence to come down on us. I mean, they've been created in the vacuum of a collapsed state in Syria, and we sort of ignored it. I mean, there was 200,000 Syrians killed before we sort of paid attention, and it doesn't really survive without sort of this bloodlust leadership that they've got.
Well, we've mentioned al-Qaeda. Let's take a closer look at the power struggle that's been going on here between ISIL and al-Qaeda. Ayman al-Zawahiri took over al-Qaeda's leadership after Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011. Before that, he served as the group's most influential ideological leader. In September, Zawahiri released a statement announcing renewed operations in Afghanistan and a new branch covering Myanmar, Bangladesh and parts of India. Some see this as a direct reaction to the rise of ISIL. Then there's the man behind ISIL, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He's declared himself leader of a new caliphate straddling Syria and Iraq, demanding that other groups pledge allegiance to him. Before ISIL, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. In April last year, he made public his group's involvement in Syria and said he was commanding al-Qaeda's affiliate there, Jabhat al-Nusra. But al-Qaeda's main leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was forced to intervene, saying each branch should focus on its own territory. Baghdadi refused, defying Zawahiri, and it's at this point that ISIL was effectively launched as a group separate from al-Qaeda. Fawaz Gagas, what also happened there is that what had been al-Qaeda in Iraq suddenly began fighting across the border, crossed into Syria. It seemed at that point a whole different game was emerging. We were no longer talking nation, you're talking territory. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think several points, Mike, just to be quickly, we don't have the time. The first point, you have a fierce civil war within the jihadist movement. You have a struggle between ISIS on the one hand and the parent organization al-Qaeda. You have a struggle between Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the chief of ISIS, and Ayman Zawahiri, the chief of the al-Qaeda parent organization. It's personal, it's instinctive, and it's happening in particular in Syria, because al-Nusra Front is the official arm of al-Qaeda, and ISIS and Nusra Front have killed hundreds, if not thousands, of men fighting against each other. The second point, what we need to understand is that al-Qaeda now, or ISIS, controls a landmass as big as the United Kingdom, where I live here. That is, you have a huge, huge mass of territories. ISIS control the lives between 5 and 8 million people between Iraq and Syria. And finally, the reason why ISIS has emerged as a powerful force, not because of the ideology of ISIS, not because of the personality of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. You have a civil war raging in Iraq and Syria. This particular civil war, Mike, has taken on sectarian connotations. What does ISIS say? ISIS pretends to be the vanguard, the protector of Sunni Arabs. It has blended itself with local poor Sunni Iraqis and Syrians, and that's why it has been able to find in Arabic what's called al-Hadina Sa'biyya, a social base. No ideology, no ideas, no theories whatsoever, without basically bridging the divide in Iraq and Syria, without finding a political solution to the struggles raging in Iraq and Syria. I fear that ISIS, even though it's a dead ender as an ideological and social movement, it's gonna be with us for many, many years, if not for a decade or so, Mike.
Eugenio, Lily, your view about that the ultimate solution to a group like ISIL is not military. There's also a massive political, socio-economic component that has to be exerted in terms of dealing with them.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see that because of the nature of the IS-led coalition is an intervention and response that goes well beyond the military intervention is needed. I think we all agree that the reasons, the grievances that are behind this insurgency are not related to, primarily related to violent extremist rhetoric. We are talking about people that want jobs, the people that want food, the people that want to see governments that are less corrupted, people that want to have a say in the politics of their countries. And then when you add all these things, you see that the response that you need is not the response that we're actually getting from the international community right now, because now we are focusing on as usual, on the short-term crisis, you know, the insurgency. We are like bombing Iraq and Syria, which is part of the solution, but is not the solution. It's not the entire solution. So we have to go beyond that, and we have to avoid the mistakes that we have usually done, like in the past, like in Libya, when we left the country thinking that everything was fine, and then now there is a civil war there.
Well, there's been widespread international condemnation of ISIL's actions, but like it or not, comments can be found on social media supporting the group. This Twitter user says, "Congratulations to the director for a new video that shows the beheading of US aid worker Peter Kassig." And this one condemns Muslim scholars who criticize the video. The tweet says, "The scholars want to distort the true image of ISIL and don't want to please God." Robert Becker, this, of course, very much in the minority, yet it exists out there, showing the depth of feeling, showing the extent of a support to groups like this. But I think it's important to actually broaden this out. The most populous Muslim nation in the world, Jakarta,
Indonesia,
which has actually provided a minimal, it appears, of fighters for ISIL, given its size. Clarity on that?
Yeah, it's the fourth largest country in the world. It has 250 million population. It's a Muslim democracy. They have identified anywhere from 60 to 100, 200 fighters that have gone over, which is a tiny fraction based on its population. But I think, and the point's been made that it's got to be more than just bombs. I mean, you know, Indonesia's successful democracy and open civil society and economic development, free media is a tremendous example for Muslim nations that are struggling with this transition that's going to take time. And so I think message-wise, we've got to actually look at some of the positives that are coming out of these emerging democracies around the world. I mean, it's true. Libya's had setbacks. Egypt had a tremendous setback with the military coup. But, you know, Tunisia so far is a good success. So, you know, we have to look not only at defeating these guys on the battlefield, but what's the long-term plan? I mean, you know, you can beat the IS, but, you know, Syria is going to have to be completely rebuilt from almost the ground up. And you've got, you know, continuing problems in Iraq.
Fawaz Gerges, this mention of Indonesia, is there a direct correlation between the relative success of a democracy and the amount of people who leave that area to go and fight for a group like ISIL?
Well, to a certain extent, yes and no. I mean, take the largest contingent of fighters in ISIS are Tunisians, 3,000 Tunisian fighters. The Saudis are the second contingent. The Jordanians are the third contingent. You have 500, between 500 and 7 British young Muslim men who are fighting inside Syria. I don't think there's a real, a direct causal link between even though you might say Tunisia is a relatively successful example. Tunisia is the most equipped Arab state to make the transition. But the reality is you have multiple conditions, socioeconomic conditions, ideological conditions. You're talking about the ability of young men to travel to Syria, and of course, ideological mobilization. At the end of the day, without putting out the fires, the sectarian fires that are raging in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and other places, without providing a vision, a political vision for the people in the region, without giving people a stake in the political future, without basically allowing people to choose their own representative instead of being their aspirations aborted, military force on its own, whether it's air power or even boots on the ground, will not resolve this social and economic and political crisis. ISIS and Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, a manifestation of a severe organic structural crisis. We need to focus on the underlying reasons that give voice and agency to these extremist groups in the heart of the Arab world.
Eugenio Lilly, your view of that comment?
I think that I do have to agree with what has been said about that, because that's also my opinion. I've written several pieces on the same issue. Like, we don't have to make the same mistakes all over again. History teaches us that narrow military interventions do not solve this kind of crisis. And what I don't see in the international community is a real commitment to implement this kind of reforms and projects that would actually address what Professor Gerges named as the underlying causes of this crisis. I don't see this commitment in the international community. As long as there will be no real wholehearted commitment to these reforms, then we will have to face the same problems all over again.
Very quickly, Robert Becker, I mean, no commitment, as we heard there from Eugenio Lilly. Is there a knowledge of what is happening as well? Knowledge of what we've heard in this discussion, that you've got to address underlying causes and not just deal with it on a military level?
Yeah, I mean, the example of Iraq, with the sort of ignoring the underlying causes of the instability in Iraq that added fuel to this, would be a classic example. I mean, the international community has to look long-term at how do we rebuild these societies and provide the jobs and opportunities and freedoms that people are demanding. And it's going to take a coordinated effort, and people need to speak up.
Well, at that particular point, my thanks to our guests, Fawaz Gerges, Eugenio Lilly, and, of course, Robert Becker with me here in Doha. And we're always interested to hear what you have to say on this and other issues. You can leave your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.